Please be seated. About 12 years ago, I found myself standing in the communion line of a Russian Orthodox church, holding an 8-year-old boy in my arms. The line slowly moved forward, and eventually we made it up to the priest, who in the Orthodox tradition took the communion spoon with a piece of bread on it, dipped it in the wine, and held it out for the boy in my arms, who proceeded to turn his head sharply to the left. The priest tried again, and the boy turned his head the other direction, refusing to take communion. The priest, after this went back and forth a little while, just looked at me and said, in a heavily thick Russian accent, "I'm sorry." So we went on our way. That boy's name was Rafik. And that summer, the summer after my sophomore year of college, I spent 12 weeks living in St. Petersburg. And about half that time I spent volunteering in a Russian orphanage for children with mental and physical disabilities. It was a bleak institutional setting. And it was really just through the work of volunteers that a lot of these children got any attention at all, beyond just sort of the cursory meeting their basic needs. So I was placed during my time there in a room with 15 children around 6 to 10 years old or so, who were all, most of whom were bedridden, who were unable to stand on their own, unable to feed themselves. All but one were unable to speak. It was a hard place to be. And their normal staff was just the one older woman who was expected to take care of all 15 of these kids and meet all of their needs throughout the day. And luckily, there were these organizations who were working in these wards of the orphanage to just provide some extra human contact, mostly to take the children out on walks, to allow them to get the only little bit of sunshine and fresh air they would over the course of the day. A lot of this volunteer effort was supported by local churches, including this Orthodox church where we went on that day, which was probably a feast day. I don't remember the exact occasion, but they invited the volunteers and to bring some of the children down and go to a service. I got to know Rafik over the course of that summer. He was one of the most active and engaged children in the room where I volunteered. And his face would just light up when I came in the room or when other folks came in the room. He was the one who was the most eager to stand up, to greet you, who desperately wanted to go on walk after walk after walk every day. And he was one of those children who you could tell just with the extra time, care, and attention was full of potential and possibility. Now, I don't know what his health conditions are, what his diagnosis was, but I do know that there was this sense that there's more going on beneath what the surface showed. And so it was natural that I would invite him or bring him with me to that church that day. And standing in that line in front of that priest, I so desperately wanted him to receive communion. I so desperately wanted him to be okay. I so desperately wanted things to be better for this child who I was holding. And it seemed like receiving communion was at least a symbolic way to achieve that. But even that was denied. In our gospel reading today, Jesus and the disciples walk into Jericho. And as they are in the city and as they are walking out of it, they encounter a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. This is a really significant moment in Mark's gospel, because there are very few of Jesus' miracles and healings where the person receiving that miracle or that healing is named. We get it at a few points, but this is really the point where Bartimaeus has a name. He has an identity. He's known to the community. He's known to the gospel writer. And what he says is significant. He says, as Jesus walks by him and he is told that it is Jesus of Nazareth who is near him, Bartimaeus cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Throughout Mark's gospel, we hear stories of people not getting who Jesus is. There's that moment where he asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And some say Elijah, and some say John the Baptist. And Peter comes out and says, "You are the Messiah." But it's pretty clear that Peter doesn't even get what that means. And yet here, just outside of Jericho, this blind beggar, someone at the far margins of society, someone at the very edge of, someone very outside of the power structures of power, wealth, status at that time, knows that Jesus is near and cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He understands that Jesus is of that line of David from which the Messiah is predicted to come. He knows that Jesus is more than than he appears to people. Even though Bartimaeus is unable to see, he perceives deeply who Jesus is and what the significance of his ministry is. Bartimaeus, who stands outside of society at its very margins, at its very edges, is strident, is firm in calling out to Jesus, affirming his identity, really understanding, getting in a deep way who Jesus is and what he can do. Bartimaeus has complete faith that this Jesus, this Messiah, will be able to heal him. And he does. He's ultimately rewarded for his faith. I think there's one way to read the Bartimaeus story that sees him as having this deep understanding despite the fact that he's blind. You read these pages and think, oh, how wonderful that, this blind person is able to get what the disciples aren't. But I think to believe that he understands despite his blindness is to miss the point. I think one of the things that this story is conveying is that perhaps Bartimaeus understands because he is blind. That he has a life experience that is different than any of the other disciples who are with Jesus day in and day out. He has a life experience that is different than so many of that time, as folks who are blind were seen as dependent, who struggled even to survive. I can't help but think that Bartimaeus' deep perception that has nothing to do with seeing is a result of his blindness, is connected to, is inseparable from his inability to see. That day at that short church in Russia, I think what I was trying to do in that communion line, or what I wanted to happen, was to impart my beliefs on how God is present to us. I wanted Rafik to receive communion, maybe for his sake, but I think more for mine, to make myself feel better about my own helplessness in this situation. That bringing him to that place where he could receive the sacrament felt like something I could do. It felt like maybe somehow him encountering God in that way, something could happen. But as I've reflected back on that day, I think I really missed the point and missed what was going on. That God was present to Rafik all along. And I think Rafik knew more about God than I did. Every time I came into that room, seeing his smile, seeing his open, outstretched arms, his enthusiasm, his eagerness to go on that daily walk, seeing love permeate through him. I think it's pretty clear to me now that he saw things, he knew more of God than I did. Or his life experience at least had brought him to understand God in a way that I never could. That the worlds that separated us geographically and through our life experience meant that inevitably we knew God in different ways. And that perhaps that sacrament that was so important to me was not that for Rafik. That wasn't the way he was going to encounter God. And I think I learned that because I encountered God through him. We understand God from our own experiences. The experiences that we have in our lives, our identities, who we are, they shape how we see God at work in the world and how God presents God's self to us. Our age, our gender, our sexual orientation, our race, our socioeconomic status, everything, where we grew up, the people we surround ourselves with, our family, all of these things shape how we perceive the world and also shape how we see God. That God meets us in the course of our lives in different ways, in ways that respond to the experiences we have, not in this sort of boilerplate, universal, generalized sort of way, but in the very specific details of our lives. Our faith isn't strength. Faith doesn't happen despite our experiences of the world, but it happens from our experiences of the world. The things that we experience, the things that happen to us, and the things that we choose to do, that form the foundations that faith is built on. I think of some of the great traditions of theology in Christian history that have really taken that idea seriously, that our social location and life experience really matters for how we understand God. I think of the faith that emerges out of the African American traditions, for the enslaved people who converted to Christianity and who truly and deeply believed in a God who made a way where there was no way. That belief in the loving, liberating God didn't come to them despite their experience of being enslaved, but from it. It was only through that experience that they could fully understand what it meant to believe in a life-giving, liberating, truly loving God. I think of Central America in the 20th century and the rise of liberation theology that held a very similar idea, that came to understand God first and foremost as a liberator. And this idea was born in communities of poor people who gathered together to read the Bible, which at that point was a revolutionary and radical thing. And in its pages, they saw all of these passages about Jesus first and foremost ministering to the poor, the outcasts, the dejected. And they saw themselves in that story. And they understood Jesus' ministry and God's presence to the people at the margins of society in a rich and deep way, that those who have plenty of wealth, plenty of material goods, plenty of power, never could. All of us come to understand God through our own life experiences. And as I look around this room and think about this community, there are a lot of different experiences represented. And that's why we gather in community. That's why none of us does this alone. This whole faith thing was never meant to be just an individual practice, something that was just, one-on-one, us and God. Because it's in community. It's when we come together and bring our various life experiences, various identities, various perspectives on the world together, that we come to have a more full picture of how God is at work in the world. None of us can never, ever know the fullness of God. Yet together, in conversation, in prayer, in community, we can come to a more full, more deep, and richer understanding of who God is and how God is at work around us. And there's also a missional aspect to this. It's important for us to seek out people whose life experiences are different than our own. It's important to get proximate, to get near to get to know people, the facts of whose lives are completely different than ours. Because through them, we can come to a deeper understanding of God, of ourselves, of the world around us. I think that is essential to what it means to be a disciple. Over the course of the next few weeks, as we continue our stewardship campaign, we're going to have a number of people, a number of members of this community speak to us about what St. George's has meant to them and how their faith has been shaped by this place. We'll hear from a diverse array of people who have come into this community at different times, who are at different stages of their lives. So I invite us to hear their perspectives. One, thinking about what role St. George's has played in your own faith journey, but also what we have to learn from each other's experiences, how the faith of one another can strengthen our own, how a community having faith, even when we ourselves are struggling, can do so much for us. Our experiences, our life's journey is a foundation for our discipleship. We come to know God more fully when we do it together. And so my prayer for us this season is to move forward with that in mind. To not just show up on Sundays looking to have our experience of God, but to seek to get to know one another, to draw closer to one another in that. To not only to be curious about how God has worked in our own lives, to be curious about one another's stories, how God has been present to each other. I think that is what Bartimaeus has to offer us today. It was through his blindness, through his place in the edge of society, that he understood who Jesus was. May we all, through our own life's experiences, come to know the fullness of how God's love is at work in this world. Amen.